Okay. Alright. Everyone should be able to hear me. We are live. Wonderful. So, it's been a while since I talked. Like, I've been just playing this game and in the zone because, like, I don't know. I've been in this mental space. It's hard to explain. I call it, wearing the crown, sitting on the throne, and holding the scepter. This guy. It's like I step into this role, being sovereign, and it's all-consuming. It's hard to explain, really. But essentially, what we're at is turn 577 on Epic. Epic is the pace of the game. Since 1963 AD, and I have been at this for a long time now. For the longest time, I only had these 6 cities here. Mainz, Berlin, Aachen, Trier, Heidelberg, and Magdeburg. And then Egypt to the south here was Big Dog, largest empire in the world. They came up through here trying to go after my ally Indonesia, who you'll notice is reduced to 1 city. We'll get into that in a minute. So I automatically declared war on her. And because I was getting no warmonger penalty, diplomatically speaking, I just rolled over her. After I put down her invasion force, I decided to keep going. It actually took a long time. Started out with Shadette here. The siege took a long time, and then I started on Aleppo. Before that siege was even done, but Aleppo fell a lot faster. Then I went for their capital. Wow. And I just went on and on and on and on, and they're gone. There's no more Egypt. Egypt is dead. I liberated Hong Kong from them. So now it's a city-state again. My ally. All these city-states are mine. Hong Kong, Geneva, Jerusalem. We got Muscat and Antioch, Zanzibar, and then Geneva. Yeah, they're all mine. And down here I have Toronto somewhere. Toronto is the most important one. I had Poland come up here, try to take Toronto. I had to liberate Toronto from Poland, so we had a war after being allies. It's crazy. So, yeah, then Indonesia stabbed me in the back. Our alliance expired. She wouldn't renew it, and she decided to get a couple of her friends up on me. Tamar of Georgia joined her. This bitch here. I mean, we're not fans. So let's just go over some of this here. Alright, so here we have Hojo from Japan. He's a backstabber. You gotta watch him. He stabbed me in the back in several games now. Everybody else is a monarchy. I'm a democracy. Last I checked, everybody else was monarchy. So then we got Wilhelma from the Dutch. She's a bitch. Oh my god, I hate her. This is the backstabbing bitch. There's Tamar of Georgia. Tamiris of Scythia is my friend in every single game I ever play. We get along great. All the time. I got somebody messaging me. Hang on a second. Okay, alright. Okay, cool. So, somebody's watching me. I know who it is. Ranjana. Now, let's see here. So this is Jayavarman of the Khmer. He's okay. We get along alright. I don't like his eyes. There's something, I mean, they got this glisten to them, like, I don't know. I don't trust, I don't know. It's not that I don't trust, it's hard to explain. And we have Pedro, from Brazil. He doesn't want to renew friends. And there's not a whole lot I can do about that, so. And then we have Jadwiga, the ruler of Poland, who insists on saying that she is a king. Yeah. See, I just let everybody come to me now because the things. Yeah, you all suck. Yeah. I've been using my spies to wreak havoc. I don't think they've been working out so good, though. I'd have to try something else on that front. So, Shadet, do you have a barracks or a stable support I need to know? Is this their encampment? Yeah. So you're gonna make some of these yahoos here. Let's get one of these. One of those. One of these. Please. Another promotion already. These are the governors. They help me, what they've really been helping me with, besides what the promotions are. So they do all this loyalty crap. So I send them to new cities that I just founded or took over or whatever, and they help me hold it down. And so let's see. Like all his promotions are obsolete. Like I don't need any of it. Let's just keep going with this guy. And get all his promotions. Well, that is unfortunate. Jakarta needs housing. Let's see. They are going to grow in 13 turns, and then they'll be at full capacity, and then we can maybe make it bigger bit for them. Oh, wow. And I could always just. There's still a lot to do. So I'm going to end up getting rid of all that anyway. As well. I'll let that finish. Because I'll get another trade route for it. So I hope the audio's alright. I know I just remember that I need to speak up, I guess, because I am kind of sitting across the room here. So I have built 4 nuclear devices and 5 thermonuclear devices. I've been building some jet bombers and some jet fighters. I've built up a little bit of a navy. I'm making some serious cash now. And we're in the post game. That's another thing. I won the game. Already won. I got the science victory. I'm still going through the other victory conditions, but I think you can do more than one. I don't know. In Civ 5, you could do all of them. But yeah, with the new Rise and Fall expansion, this game has really come into being. It's really beautiful. I really like it. I just hope that we don't have that game-breaking glitch way late in the game that we used to have, where on some AI term it crashes the game. And it's this bug that has been carried on and on and on and on and on. And nobody could figure out what it was. I hope they fixed it. Nobody could figure out what it was, or was causing it. And it seemed to happen so rarely, yet it would happen to me. Every game, inevitably. So, I put all this time into it. So, but, I always was able to finish, quote unquote, finish the game part, See, now we're in simulation mode, essentially. The game is over, we're in simulation mode. I won. I sent the colony off to Mars. Yeah. Exciting stuff. I built a lot of wonders. And they all have their own tiles in the map. Maybe, I did a tour of them in one video already, but I'll show you a couple. There's the Sydney Opera House. This is Heidelberg, one of my favorite cities. So it has these. There's a governor that lets me build them, and I think if I move that governor from city to city, I could eventually have these things in all the coastal cities. These special fisheries. And here we have the Statue of Liberty, having fermented unrest. I think it's time for you to start doing other things, because this unrest thing doesn't seem to... I was hoping that it would recruit partisans like before, but now it's just, I don't know. Oh, wow. Let's go to somebody else and give somebody else problems. I'm thinking, let's go back to Georgia. I was going to go to Japan, but we're on neutral terms right now. And there's, I already have somebody coming to La Venta, this city-state. You'll see why. I'm thinking Susa. Right on the border here with Carthage, which I had to take. Carthage was a city-state that... See, Brazil found this city here, and they're about to lose it, so I better get ready for that. Wow, I really wasn't done showing you. Okay, so Brazil built this city here, my friend Pedro, and he could never hold on to it, and I was liberating it to negate warmonger penalties from conquering Indonesia, and then he was conquering Carthage, and he couldn't hold on to that. It kept revolting. So I liberated Carthage once, and then he conquered it again, and every time you conquer it, you're doing more damage to the city. That means more rebuilding, and then the population shrinks further and further. Now it's tiny, everything's damaged. I gotta fix everything. It sucks, but whatever. I got it, and I got my best governor here for holding on to the city. Amani will get into her later, I guess. And then, so I took this, and I got some spy coming to La Venta that might be able to, I might be able to get control of La Venta, we'll put it that way. Not like as my own city, but as like a city-state ally or whatever. So I'm going to send somebody to Sousa and see what I can cook up here. Because this Amani here, she does these things with loyalty towards cities, my cities and other people's cities around her. All get affected. Her loyalty all gets affected by her. And I'm going to send a spy here to foment unrest. A spy here to do some kind of scandal shit. I don't know. I don't know what that's about. We'll find out. We got our archaeologist here. We need a trader. We also need I think we're going to need a neighborhood. Why is it even recommending one? Like, it'll recommend neighborhoods when it doesn't even need them. Oh, wow, I could build more connecting farms here. And, you know, let me see if... Stop it. Just out of curiosity. You know... I can't get that tall, so... Technically, it doesn't need a builder right now. I don't know why they would recommend a campus. It's just dead. We're done with that shit. Let's do a trader. Yeah, I don't think I did everything right here. We get like a 9 tile radius effect here. See, I'm starting to drift off. I'm getting... Anyway, it's time to turn something on. I'm going to turn my mic off and turn something on here. I can't keep talking. I'm just like, I don't know. My mind is wandering.
Now on the History Channel, stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. Werewolves. Today's images of these man-turned-wolf monsters mostly came from the make-believe world of Hollywood. But the ancient Greeks and Romans believed werewolves actually existed and were absolutely deadly. Shockingly, In the 16th century, 30,000 people in France were accused of being werewolves. As we go in search of history, we'll discover the beliefs, fears, and hysteria that surround legends of the werewolves. People have always had a macabre fascination with what terrifies them most. Whether it's real-life savagery of serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, or imagined monsters like Frankenstein and Dracula, humans are irresistibly drawn to these horrifying subjects. One of the most ancient and enduring is the werewolf.
There were werewolf stories as far back as you find recorded stories. And in all countries, in Greece, in Middle Europe, in Asia, they're everywhere.
At the dawn of civilization, there was little that separated man from beast. People then thought humans could revert to animals, a belief called shape-shifting.
Virtually every society, primitive societies and so forth, have stories and beliefs about transformation from animal to human form and vice versa. You go back even on the cave paintings, you have pictures of what appear to be half man, half stag.
All civilization has probably been a story of, keeping certain impulses and emotions and urges in check, and most of these are the more primitive instincts, the animal instincts. So ever since man started becoming civilized, the werewolf has been lurking somewhere back there in the shadow.
Not so much in the shadows that the werewolf wasn't noted by the ancient Greek and father of history, Herodotus. In the 5th century BC, he reported in his travels of a shape-shifting people known as Neurians.
Each Neurian changes himself once a year into the form of a wolf, and he continues in that form for several days, after which he resumes his former shape.
You find very strong werewolf myths among the Greeks, among the Romans. I mean, you got Roman werewolf stories which sound like they were, they were produced by Hollywood last week.
One of these stories came from a Roman satirist named Petronius. He was among the first to chronicle an enduring connection between werewolves and a full moon. Petronius wrote of a man who, on a night lit by a full moon, went to visit his mistress. He asked a soldier friend to accompany him. Along the way, the soldier suddenly stopped, stripped off his clothes, transformed into a wolf, and ran into the darkness.
The full moon really does have a connection with genuine werewolf lore, because there is a belief that somehow the full moon creates madness in people, lunacy, moon. So the full moon and the transformation from man to beast is a natural, magical connection.
Arriving at his mistress's home, the man learned that a servant had fought off a wolf with a sword, wounding it in the neck. The next day, the man discovered the soldier in his barracks, dying of a sword wound to his neck.
These were stories that were widely told and widely believed, that if you were wounded as a wolf, you transformed back into human form, but the wound stayed with you.
An even more horrifying account of a werewolf came from the Roman poet Ovid. Writing in the 1st century, he told of an ancient Greek king named Lycaon, whose cruelty was so notorious that the king of the gods, Jupiter himself, paid him a visit. But Lycaon refused to believe his visitor was a god, and tested him by serving a sumptuous feast in which he had secretly mixed human flesh.
Cannibalism, even among the ancient Greeks, was a no-no. I mean, that was a real taboo. To put a cannibal meal before a god was a tremendous offense.
Jupiter instantly detected the tainted food. Furious, he turned Lycaon into a wolf so he could pursue his penchant for human flesh in a more suitable form. From the name of King Lycaon comes the word lycanthrope, meaning one who transforms into a wolf.
This story has had a profound effect upon our understanding of werewolves, because here, right at the very beginning, was recognition that the whole idea of werewolfism was related to those aspects of the human being that were opposed to civilization and civilized society.
During the Middle Ages, the belief that humans transform into animal predators was prevalent around the world, and was by no means limited to wolves. In Lapland, there were were-reindeer. In South America, were-opossums. And in Japan, were-wildcats.
What we're talking about is a phenomena where people believe they or some of their neighbors can change into an animal. That animal is the predominant predator of the area.
People then believed that donning the skin or pelt of an animal was one way to become that animal. Vikings made this belief a part of their military arsenal by getting into bear skins before battle. This practice contributed to their reputation for being absolutely fearless and maniacal warriors. They were called barsark, a term that survives today as the word berserk.
What the word really means in the ancient language is the men in bear shirts. What the berserkers would do is they put on these bearskin shirts and feel that they had been in some way magically imbued with the courage, the strength, the ferocity of a bear. They were very much feared, and they were known to be completely out of, they were out of control. They were no longer human.
Throughout medieval Europe, however, it was the wolf that was most feared. As the largest carnivore in the area, it was thought to be the most dangerous predator people might encounter. Montague Summers, a 19th century authority on occultism and the supernatural, aptly described what the wolf meant to medieval Europeans.
The distinctive features of the wolf are unbridled cruelty, bestial ferocity, and ravening hunger. He has something of the demon of hell. He's the symbol of night and winter, of stress and storm, the dark and mysterious harbinger of death.
Cautionary stories about wolves were widely repeated, especially to the most vulnerable part of the population, children. One of the most famous of these is Little Red Riding Hood.
Oh, Grandma, what big teeth you have!
The better to eat you with, my dear.
But it is a very, very sinister story, and it's clearly a werewolf story, because here you've got the little girl, and here you've got the wolf dressed up like grandmother. You have the wolf talking to Little Red Riding Hood. This is no ordinary wolf. Clearly, this is a werewolf.
As we go in search of history, werewolf hysteria sweeps through Europe. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was a hotbed of werewolf activity. It was a tumultuous time, racked with irrational fears, superstition, and sweeping religious change.
During the height of the Middle Ages, particularly as the Reformation was about to begin, the great struggle against witchcraft, the burning times, began to occur. And right on the heels of the struggle against witchcraft, a new struggle with werewolfism began, and all of a sudden there was this new wave of belief that werewolves and witches all existed and that they were all having a supernatural and negative impact upon society.
The panic surrounding werewolves grew from witchcraft hysteria. From 1300 to 1700, thousands of people were brought to trial on charges of witchcraft. The accusations, human sacrifice, cannibalism, and sexual license, came primarily from peasants, and the accused were almost exclusively peasants as well. Witchcraft hysteria was fueled partly by economic and societal problems. Poverty, disease, crime, and famine commonly plagued Europe. Peasants, no matter how hard they worked, ended up with less. With almost no way to climb out of the bottom, many peasants blamed their poverty and other troubles on the witchery of their neighbors. So other peasants became scapegoats for incurable social ills.
People really are on the brink. That's when misfortune hits them. And it's all part of a society purging itself violently and horrifically when it's under extreme emotional and physical pressure.
Witch fears were also fueled by religion. Then the Catholic Church was the dominant force in people's lives. It dictated behavior and provided explanations for phenomena people didn't understand. According to church doctrine, Satan intended to destroy Christian civilization and required hordes of disciples, witches, to do so. Sorcery was viewed as treason, an attempt to overthrow the church.
It's the time when Christendom splits in half as never before, when Protestantism appears, and suddenly it looks as if Lucifer's legions are pouring out. This is an all-out struggle.
To thwart sorcery, the Church created the Inquisition, an extreme legal process that made massive witch hunting possible. Bishops serving as inquisitors sought out heretics, those who spoke or wrote against the traditions of the Roman Church. By 1231, Inquisition courts under direct control of the papacy were established across Europe. Heretics who repented received a sentence of life imprisonment. Those who wouldn't repent were usually burned alive. The Inquisition ruthlessly pursued a bloody course. Its goal was to annihilate all people who were not sincere Roman Catholic Christians. Among the victims, Protestants, Jews, witches, mystics, and werewolves. Werewolfism, or lycanthropy, was considered a form of witchcraft. Both involved a pact with the devil, heresy.
People all around were afraid that strange, magical things were happening to other people and against them. Once a hysteria begins, it tends to spread. So that when a really gruesome crime was met up with, werewolves were immediately suspected.
By the 16th century, the secular courts had adopted Inquisition procedures to protect society from witches and werewolves. In 1532, judicial torture became the legal means to determine malevolent witchcraft and lycanthropy.
You can't actually prove the crime materially. You can't prove that somebody cast a spell at a particular moment. So the only sure way of obtaining a verdict is a confession. And once you've got that idea into your head, the best way of obtaining a confession is to apply force.
Inquisitors, hearing these confessions and finding it hard to contemplate the inhuman and sadistic horrors of the crimes enumerated, preferred to think of them as having been committed by a true monster, half man, half wolf, in league with the devil. In France, the term for werewolf was loup-garou, and suddenly in the early 1500s, werewolves began to appear there in epidemic proportions. According to legend, they could be easily identified.
You've got eyebrows that meet together. Good sign of a werewolf. Werewolves have hair growing on their palms. Of course, they shave, but they have very rough palms there. So the rough palms are a sign of a werewolf. Anybody in 16th century France, who lived off alone, isolated from other people, who was unkempt, who behaved in a wild, strange, or disagreeable manner, might easily be thought of as a werewolf.
In a slew of accusations and arrests between 1520 and 1630, more than 30,000 people in France alone were brought to trial accused of being werewolves. Typical was the story of a 16th century peasant named Gilles Garnier. He had the telltale eyebrows that met in the middle and lived like a hermit in a hut outside the city of Dole. Villagers rescuing a girl from an attacking wolf thought they recognized Gilles in the animal. They believed he had transformed himself by rubbing a magic salve on his skin. 1 week later, Gilles was seized, barbarously tortured into a confession, and burned at the stake. But the victims of werewolf hunts were by no means limited to men. One famous account of a she-wolf came from central France. In the Auvergne region, a hunter was attacked by a wolf in 1558. In the fierce battle, the hunter managed to slice off a paw. Putting the severed limb in his pouch, he stopped by a nobleman's chateau to relate his adventure. But when he pulled out the paw, he found the slender hand of a woman with a gold wedding band on one finger. Recognizing the ring, the nobleman raced upstairs and found his wife bandaging the bloody stump of her arm. She confessed to being a werewolf and was burned at the stake. Confessions, however, were of doubtful authenticity because of the interrogation process.
Then they sort of, boil people in oil and put it, tortured them with hot pincers. And you'd be surprised how quickly somebody's going to confess to being a werewolf or a witch under those circumstances.
Such was the fate in 1589 of a poor peasant named Peter Stump. He was accused of becoming a werewolf by donning a magic pelt. Never mind that no pelt was ever found. Authorities had a confession elicited with the aid of red-hot pincers, the wheel, and by pulling flesh from his bones, all of which was depicted in a sensational publication of the times known as a broadside. Stump's fate became the best known of all werewolves because the broadside was devoured by people seeking escape from the relentless grind of daily life.
It's a bestseller in 16th century Europe. I mean, people loved that sort of stuff. They still do today. But this was supposed to be real. I mean, these broadsides were the National Enquirers of their day.
One werewolf trial in 1604 made legal history with an unprecedented incident of compassion. The defendant was Jean Grenier, a 14-year-old shepherd from the Bordeaux region of France. He was a slow-witted boy. Today he would be termed mentally disabled, given to roaming the countryside. When a witness testified that she had seen him put on a magic pelt and turn into a wolf, he was arrested. He claimed that a mysterious dark stranger, the devil perhaps, had given him the pelt, which turned him into a werewolf. He freely admitted to stalking the forest, coming upon children and attacking them. The courtroom erupted in uncomfortable laughter when Grenier described his preference for young flesh, finding an old woman as tough as leather. This made him a sure candidate for execution. However, a lawyer made an impassioned speech that he was a victim of his disordered brain. The argument of insanity prevailed, and instead of death, Grenier was sentenced to prison in a monastery, where he steadily deteriorated and died before the age of 20.
That was sort of remarkable that somebody would look at a case like this and say, wait a minute, this is not a werewolf. This person does not turn into a wolf.
When In Search of History returns, some explanations for what happened. As early as the 2nd century AD, Roman doctors astonishingly recognized werewolfism as a psychological disease, a form of depression. But the treatment seemed as bad as a werewolf attack, the opening of a vein and letting of blood. While the cure was barbaric, the diagnosis was quite perceptive. Today, psychiatrists have a name for the mental illness in which a person believes he or she actually changes into a wolf, lycanthropy. Such a person may even howl, crave raw meat, or run around on all fours during an attack of this sickness.
There are now enough cases that we can begin to look at them and see that there are people who have these grand delusions that they can change and do change into different animals, and that when they get into that delusion, they even act out the part and do things that we think of as being associated with the animals.
By the mid-17th century, people had begun to realize that those who proclaimed themselves to be wolves were instead insane. Many victims were sent off to monasteries rather than being burned at the stake. A few imagined werewolves were not insane, though. They might have been under the influence of drugs. Ointments were often concocted by so-called witches to treat the illnesses of peasant folk. Into a cauldron went plants and herbs such as poppy seeds from opium, aconite or wolfbane, which slows down the heart, and belladonna, a poisonous plant also known as deadly nightshade. When rubbed into the skin, this magic salve entered the bloodstream and induced mental confusion, wild excitement, and delirium. Thinking one had become a werewolf would not be out of the question. Another possible hallucinogen occurred in rye bread, a staple of the European peasant's diet in the Middle Ages. When winters were extremely cold, a fungus called ergot infected the rye. The bread could induce LSD-type hallucinations, such as seeing a werewolf or being one.
Suddenly, a perfectly normal person became wild, mad, bestial, whatever. It affects the brain. People go quite nuts. They run around and you know, act crazy. And there have been murders, berserk situations that have been attributed to people eating this poison.
Reports of villagers frightened by the sight of a ragged human running through the forest fueled fears of werewolves. But the culprit was often just a hermit. And there were a few cases of feral or wild children who, after being lost or abandoned, had learned forest survival skills. Amala and Kamala were among 16 children supposedly raised by wolves who were found in India between 1843 and 1933. When the girls were removed from a wolf lair in 1920, they walked on all fours, ate nothing but raw meat, and howled to escape captivity. Amala died within 1 year at the age of about 2.5. Kamala died 9 years later at age 17. Perhaps the most famous feral child was Victor of Aveyron, whose story was told in the 1969 François Truffaut film, The Wild Child. In 1797, French villagers became frightened by a mysterious wild man seen running through the woods. 3 years later, a naked 12-year-old boy was captured. He was covered with cuts and bruises and terrified of humans. And he preferred to eat nuts and berries to any prepared food. Victor lived to the age of 40, but never learned to speak. Another explanation for werewolf sightings could be two medical diseases discovered later. One, hypertrichosis, is a rare genetic disorder that occurs in 1 in every billion births. It causes increased hair growth all over the body.
And this can be very extensive, so extensive that it virtually covers the skin surface and makes the child look like a dog or animal or a werewolf.
In the 16th century, this disease was observed in Peter Gonzalez and his children.
There are these wonderful drawings of the people with these furry faces, looking, by the way, very much like the Lon Chaney Jr. makeup.
During the Middle Ages, such people could have easily been mistaken for werewolves.
Seeing these pictures would lead people to believe, oh my, yes, yeah, goodness, yes, it's all true.
The second disease that may have helped perpetuate the werewolf myth is porphyria. It's an extremely rare form of a genetic blood disorder first recognized early in the 20th century. In some severe cases, patients are so sensitive to sunlight that prolonged exposure could result in the loss of tissue from the extremities, face, and head.
Somebody like this might tend to come out late at night. If they had a lot of damage to their tissues, their hands particularly, their hands might be sort of tend to hold their hands in a clawed up position. If the tissue was lost from their lips, their teeth would be more exposed, and there would be this brownish color which people might associate with blood, plus this slight amount of extra hair growth, particularly around the temples.
Some experts dispute the scientific and medical data, saying they are insufficient explanations for the broad-based, pervasive belief in werewolves during the 16th and 17th centuries.
Werewolf beliefs are not just in a few places where LSD might have gotten into the food supply. Werewolves are not just in a few places where there might have been outbreaks or family traditions of porphyria. It's a much larger phenomena than that. The werewolf mythos has come down to us through the ages, basically as a myth about our inner nature, the animal side of us as we like to think about it, as opposed to the spiritual side. It has a certain amount of appeal because we are animals, after all.
I think it's a mistake to go look for rational explanations, because on some level it's not. People have always been fascinated with the blurred boundary, between human beings and animals, especially of the fear of the beast within.
When In Search of History returns, Hollywood creates the ultimate werewolf saga. Despite a lineage that dates back to ancient times, most of what is familiar today about werewolves comes from the 1941 movie, The Wolfman.
Whoever is bitten by a werewolf and lives becomes a werewolf himself.
Starring Lon Chaney Jr. as the werewolf, the monster is instantly recognizable.
Universal's The Wolfman was the premier horror icon of the 1940s. It was the first really original, monster that had come down the pike for a long time.
The Wolfman is a great, great film. What the werewolf lacks is a great novel. And that's perhaps why the werewolf is not quite as popular as the vampire or the Frankenstein monster or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are a lot of very fine werewolf stories, but there's nothing to match Dracula, nothing to match Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Typical of the literary attempts was an 1846 Victorian potboiler by G.W.M. Reynolds, Wagner the Werewolf. It was serialized a chapter at a time in the pulp magazines of the day that were known as penny dreadfuls.
It's sort of rolling Victorian prose, the werewolf snatching off the golden-haired, violet-eyed child, the mother screaming, all of this kind of stuff, which was meant to thrill the working men and shop girls of 19th century England.
Nearly 20 years later, in 1865, a more scholarly work appeared, a collection of legends assembled by the cleric Sabine Baring Gould in The Book of Werewolves. But the first novel to gain literary recognition would not be published until 1933. Written by Hollywood screenwriter Guy Endore and set in France, It was called The Werewolf of Paris.
This was actually based upon a real case of a French soldier who had gotten into the cemeteries of Paris and was actually ghoul-like, eating the blood and gore of the recently dead. But this story traced him as if he were a werewolf. And then in 1935, it was turned into a movie that was quite successful.
The movie, renamed The Werewolf of London, swapped Paris for London to appeal to its English-speaking audience.
When my experiments are completed, I will show their results to the entire world, not before.
Remember this, Dr. Glendon. The werewolf instinctively seeks to kill the thing it loves best.
It was the first feature-length werewolf film, and though well received, the film failed to become the benchmark for the genre. The reason? The censors. Censors felt the transformation from man into beast was too close a parallel to Darwin's controversial theory of evolution. Especially coming hot on the heels of the infamous Scopes monkey trial, a fiercely debated case in which a Tennessee schoolteacher was prosecuted for presenting evolution to his class. Thus, the crucial scene of any werewolf movie, the transformation, happened off-screen. With the film's box office success, Universal Studios was eager to produce another. But again, they ran into censorship. As Adolf Hitler was tightening his Nazi noose around Europe, censors decided that horror movies had no place in the tension-ridden times.
Just before World War II, there was an international embargo on Hollywood horror movies, and they stopped making them for a few years because the British Board of Film Censors was very concerned that this was a demoralizing kind of form of entertainment.
Curiously, Hitler was fascinated with wolves. Typical was the term he chose for his dreaded U-boats, the wolf pack, so called for their tactic of surrounding a convoy and mercilessly picking off one ship at a time.
Adolf Hitler was absolutely fascinated with wolf imagery. He surrounded himself with all kinds of totems and liked to name things after wolves. And one of his favorite American motion pictures was The Three Little Pigs. And he used to whistle, "Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?" you know, as he went about his bunker.
The ban on horror movies, however, would itself become a war casualty. It turned out that moviegoers needed an emotional release. And horror movies fit the bill.
In the Wolfman movies, starring Lon Chaney, that Universal Pictures made, is an American character who's kind of displaced into a 1940s Europe where there is no war, but there's a werewolf behind every tree. And what you have in the Wolfman saga is the werewolf trying to put to sleep the beast in human nature. All of this, you know, happening against the real-world backdrop of the war. And it's probably not a coincidence that the Wolfman saga began right after Pearl Harbor and wound up just in time for Hiroshima.
The Wolfman established the defining traits of a werewolf. His appearance when the moon was full. The mark of the pentagram, a satanic emblem that pointed to the werewolf's next victim. And death by a silver bullet. Silver purportedly being to werewolves as garlic is to vampires. But the most memorable was the transformation from man to wolf. The first time audiences had ever seen this on screen. The overwhelming power of the visual would change the public's perception of the monster for all time.
One of the things that both stage and screen do to complex folk mythology is they simplify it and put it together so that you can have it easily available to you. Movies helped us in understanding the werewolf by simplifying it and giving it some characteristics we could identify with.
The werewolf's movie characteristics were created by German emigrant and screenwriter Kurt Siodmak.
I've got to give credit to Kurt Siodmak, who I think is the father of all modern werewolf myths. The full moon, the silver bullet, pentagram in the hand. As far as I know, Kurt Siodmak invented all that.
I look with the eye of a camera when I write for motion pictures. So I invented certain things, like the pentagram. Maybe it exists before, I don't know.
Siodmak also invented a few lines of verse that chilled the spines of millions of viewers and became a classic quote of the genre.
Even a man who is pure in heart and does his prayers at night will become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
The result of Siodmak's brilliantly conceived screenplay was that Hollywood had simply made up its own rules about the werewolf, rules that stuck.
Everybody believes that the real way to become a werewolf is you'll be bitten by a werewolf. That comes right out of the films. No, that's strictly Hollywood law. When a werewolf didn't bite people. A werewolf tore them to bits and ate them. There wasn't going to be enough left of the victim to become another werewolf. But it was that film that for modern America, I think for probably the modern world, has fixed the image of the werewolf as this flat-faced, furry thing with fangs. But that's the Hollywood werewolf. It's not the werewolf of ancient legend.
When In Search of History continues, the werewolf legend still has the power to fascinate. Despite all that's known about werewolves, from ancient legends and myths to scientific and medical explanations, the animal continues to instill intense debate. Conservationist groups fight for the right of the wolf to exist, believing he symbolizes all that is wild and free in nature. Others would prefer wolves be eradicated completely, seeing them as dangerous and destructive predators. Humans' uneasy relationship with the wolf continues.
Man has a beast inside him, and there's this sort of secret desire to change into one and lose all the civilized restraints. The more civilized we are, the more we need to at least fantasize about no longer being civilized.
Such fantasies became widespread when the old werewolf films were released on television in the 1950s. Children began to develop an affinity with the scary creature.
It wasn't until the films were released to television and were really available to the public to see, and the kids started getting their hands on them, they adopted them. Because at 12 years old, monsters, you latch onto that because they're not understood any more than you are. They have a tough time dealing with their environments, just like you do. But they can fight back, and you fantasize through those characters.
Rather than an object of fear, the werewolf was becoming a pop culture icon. In 1972, Marvel Comics legend Stan Lee created a series, Werewolf by Night.
They're fun to read about. You know, even little kids, they're always looking under the bed, hoping there isn't a monster under the bed or an ogre. And there is something fascinating about the idea that maybe in some way, some people do change at night into something else.
Contemporary adults have been reticent to abandon the werewolf as mere kid stuff. Gary Brandner's best-selling 1977 novel The Howling, about a contemporary coven of werewolves, became a cult classic in part by focusing on the werewolf's raw sexuality and lust.
The face of the wolf was only an inch from his own. Its breath hot and damp hissed in his ear. The glistening teeth, as long as two of his finger joints, snapped at the air and moved closer to his throat. Part of the joy of being a werewolf is that you can go out and jump any lady werewolf you want to, and no one's going to look funny at you. It's the freedom to be as sexy and lustful as you want to.
Modern werewolves even stalk the internet. A live-action role-playing game, Werewolf: The Apocalypse, is so popular that it attracts thousands of players around the world.
We use the internet to link up a whole bunch of games across the United States and actually across the different nations, and where we communicate to each other about what's happening in each of our games. And so we create this shared universe of many little games, making a larger game.
The werewolf of this kind of a group is not your ravening, child-killing beast. They're New Age werewolves. They're really representative of a lot of good things in the world.
Thank you.
In 1997, the United States Post Office joined the monster craze with 5 movie monster stamps. Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman is back in vogue more than 50 years after writer Kurt Siodmak created the character.
It's something which might live much longer. It only shows you shouldn't be a writer, should be a postage stamp. Then you're immortal.
The werewolf has evolved throughout history. What most of us now accept as legend was once very real. It began as a way to explain the unexplainable, a creature to blame for the atrocities of man, and a symbol of the sexuality and power that many humans envied but could not attain. The werewolf holds a prominent place in our past and continues to live on, primarily for our entertainment, as we discover when we go in search of history.
Vampires, night-lurking creatures that prey on our deepest fears at the margin between life and death. Fiction and fantasy have molded our perception of these night stalkers. But what is the truth of the vampire?
Vampires were somewhere between a nuisance and a danger. They could curdle the milk in your cows, they could steal your sheep, they could physically attack you or your family.
Now, forensics, medicine, and science are uniting to expose the facts behind the fiction.
Natural changes of decomposition can build into the appearance of the vampire, the living dead.
They're proving vampires are much more than simple horror stories.
The stakes were placed there deliberately to stop this man from transforming himself.
For some people, vampires are still a terrifying reality.
I saw him coming at night. He was sucking my blood.
This is my pitchfork. I used it to remove his heart. To unlock the vampire, we'll travel to Europe and beyond. Even upgrade vampires from creatures of legend to historical fact. In 1897, a mysterious boat slowly floated its way into Whitby Harbour on the northeast coast of England. Everyone on board was either missing or dead.
the very instant the shore was touched, an immense dog sprang up on deck from below and, running forward, jumped from the bow onto the sand. Making straight for the steep cliff where the churchyard hangs over the laneway, it disappeared into the darkness, which seemed intensified just beyond the focus of the searchlight.
With these words, Bram Stoker's infamous vampire Dracula was introduced to the world and entered the popular psyche.
Everything about vampires is in Count Dracula. The archetypal image of the vampire as we now know it.
But where did Stoker's tale of Gothic horror originate? And could there be a real-life figure behind his creation? Vampires exist in every culture. China's Shang-Chi, Yaramayahu from Australia, the Indian Azrapa, the Jararaca of Brazil, or the many European incarnations such as the Strix, Strigoi, Vrikolacas, Revenant, Upir, Vampire, Dracul. Such creatures predate the Bible, yet they weren't just myths, they were very real. Reanimated corpses that feed on the living to prevent their own decay. Dan Jones is an author and historian with a particular interest in society's portrayal of vampires.
There have always been vampire stories in Europe, but it really comes to a head in the 18th century when the French theologian Calmet starts putting together a dossier of vampire tales, actually in an attempt to debunk vampire myths. Unfortunately, what that does is give vampire stories legitimacy because they're being engaged with by the sort of scientific men of the age. By the turn of the 19th century, the vampire myth starts feeding into Gothic literature. And so you have Polidori, who starts writing The Vampire. That's really the template for what Bram Stoker does when he writes Dracula. And every time you have the vampire story reinvented, it totally reflects the preoccupations and the concerns of the society that's reinventing. In the 20th century, you have Nosferatu, and there's a kind of strain of anti-Semitism in it. In Hammer Horror, the vampire story is a lot more bloody, it's a lot more violent. In Anne Rice's interview with a vampire, you have a real undercurrent of homosexuality. And when you get to Blade, say, in the late 90s, there's this sort of high-tech futurism that, again, characteristic of that society.
And fictional vampires continue to reflect our morality today.
If you look at the 21st century, the Twilight movies and books, the vampire is the geek, but actually there's a beautiful story in there as well. I mean, that's totally 21st century morals all over.
Preying on our ethics was no doubt at the forefront of Stoker's mind when he dreamt up Dracula.
Is this cemetery where the Count first bites Lucy Westenra, this very pure 19-year-old virgin? Now, she eventually transforms into a sort of lusty vampire herself who terrorises North London, biting young children. And it's this mixture of sex and scandal that Stoker was doing pretty deliberately to titillate and to scare and to shock his audience, and probably to help build his sales figures at the same time.
Bram Stoker's Dracula is so successful, it hasn't been out of print for over a century. Yet, unlike Stoker's Count, the real-life vampires of history were not charismatic gentlemen with a black cape, mesmerizing stare, and a penchant for nubile young women.
The vampires of the Greek folklore were not glamorous like the Hollywood vampire. They were bloated corpses that spread on diseases.
You're not going to get people swooning over deformed Mediterranean peasants slobbering along, biting chunks out of your breast.
Now, recent discoveries on a small Greek island are revealing who these creatures really were and what it took to become one. Professor Hector Williams has been conducting archaeological research on the Greek island of Lesbos for over 30 years. But it was in 1988 that he made a discovery that could put flesh onto the stories of vampires.
standing on top of the ancient city wall of Mytilene. For 5 seasons, with more than 40 workmen, we dug on both sides of it and around it. Dozens of discoveries emerged. A Roman brothel over there, a Hellenistic industrial district down here, pottery from the age of Sappho 600 years before Christ down below. But nothing prepared us for the remarkable discovery we were going to make at the far end of the wall, built actually into the wall itself.
It was a discovery that shook the very foundations of archaeology. Proof that vampires may not just be creatures of legend, but of historical fact.
We're here on the edge of the ancient city wall, and it was at this point that we discovered the wall had been cut into and a crypt very carefully excavated, in which a wooden coffin had been lowered and heavy stones placed on top.
For some reason, somebody had gone to the huge effort of digging a grave right into the foundations of the city walls. But that wasn't the only mystery.
It stretched along here for about 2 meters, and in it were sprawling the remains of a middle-aged man, creature our students nicknamed Vlad after Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad the Impaler was a 15th century ruler of Romania and was probably the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. And like his counterpart, Hector's Vlad came to a sticky end.
He had spikes driven through his throat, his middle, and his ankles to hold him in the tomb. This is not a normal burial.
A corpse nailed into his coffin. 3 20-centimeter long metal stakes driven through his body, into his ankle, pelvis, and neck. This was unique.
We found over 50 burials in this area of men and women, and this one had received very special treatment, the treatment of a suspected vampire.
So who was Vlad, and why was he considered to be a vampire? Hector turned to Greek-born paleopathologist Anastasia Seliki for answers. She found that far from the fanged figure of fiction, this vampire was surprisingly ordinary.
He was Mr. Average, but for some reason upon his death, the villagers believed that he would become a vampire or a revenant. So when he did die, they took every measure they could in order to prevent him from striking back at the living.
Aged 40 to 50 years, Vlad had been fit and strong. He was probably a laborer, and he had eaten a decent diet. But for some reason, when he died, he didn't get a normal burial. Instead, he'd been nailed into a crude coffin and hidden right inside the city walls. But why was he treated in such a way?
He may have had some characteristics that made him suspect in his lifetime, so they weren't taking any chances.
This was a man that they did not want to see again, alive or dead.
Why were the locals so scared of Vlad? And why was he considered to be a vampire? Clues may lie 1,000 miles to the west beneath a quintessential English parish church. St. Leonard's Church in Hythe in southern England is a church with a secret. Paleopathologist Anastasia Seliki has come here not to marvel at its grand stained glass windows, but to pay homage to a clandestine space beneath the chancel. A crypt containing the bones of over 4,000 people, a place that may hold clues to the origins of vampire belief.
There are many theories about who these people were. Some say that they were the victims of a great battle, others that they were the victims of the Black Death. But recent studies have found soil inside some of the skulls. So we believe that these were ordinary citizens of Hythe. And in the 13th century, when the church needed to be expanded, they were dug up from the churchyard and they were brought here. There's nothing unusual about this. Bone crypts like these existed all over Europe, and it was not rare for the bones to be dug up and put in ossuaries or crypts.
40 miles south of Prague in the Czech Republic, the Church of All Saints in the town of Kutná Hora has taken the idea of bone crypts to the extreme. Known as the Sedlec Ossuary, this is the largest bone tomb in Europe and holds the remains of up to 70,000 people. Originally a simple pile of bones dug up from the graveyard, like those in Hythe, when the church was extended in the 14th century, it wasn't until the 1870s that it took on this macabre, Gothic display. There are 4 enormous bell-shaped mounds in each corner of the chapel, and a colossal chandelier containing at least one of every bone in the human body, hanging from the center of the nave.
The dead don't necessarily stay buried forever. In many cultures, they dig up the bodies and they keep the bones in a mausoleum, a family grave, or an ossuary.
Although rarely as ornate, bone crypts and mausoleums are still commonplace the world over.
My family has its own burial plot on a small island in Greece, so one day I hope that my bones will be transferred there so that I can rest alongside my ancestors.
Back on Lesbos, Hector Williams is visiting a modern-day cemetery to see whether this practice of relocating the bones could explain the ancient Greeks' belief in vampires.
Sign in the village cemetery mentions because of the small size of the second cemetery of Mytilene, we ask relatives of the deceased to proceed with the exhumation of their relatives in timely fashion after 3 years post-mortem.
Even today, bones are being exhumed to free up space for new burials.
We're here by a modern grave in the cemetery, one that will soon be exhumed and the body placed in a box and transferred to the charnel house. You can see part of a leg bone coming out of the ground. There's a backbone here. There's a bit of rib coming up there with flesh still on it. And very conspicuous at the end of the grave is the skull.
So, could a familiarity with the remains of the dead have led to a belief in the undead?
The problem started when something unexpected happened. For example, when the villagers went to dig up the body to transfer the bones, and instead of the skeleton, they found a corpse looking fresh. To them, there were only 2 solutions. Either that was the body of a saint, or they were dealing with the work of the devil, and in this case, they thought they were dealing with a vampire or a revenant.
But could there be a more natural explanation for the lack of decay?
Popular misconception is that a body will decompose quite fast after death. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth.
Professor Richard Shepherd is one of the UK's leading pathologists, a forensics expert and a real-life CSI. He even advises the British government on mysterious deaths.
The speed at which a body does decompose depends on the state of the body at the time of death and the ground in which the body is buried. The body normally contains millions and millions of bacteria. Mostly they're beneficial to the body and help in digestion and help to an extent in protecting the body against infection. Of course, after death, there's nothing left for these bacteria to feed on, and they'll start to digest the body itself.
This is the natural process of decay, the body's bacteria given the freedom to feed. And the result would normally be a pile of bones ready to be moved into the ossuary or mausoleum. But they had to be cleaned first.
People in the past did not necessarily know the connection between the spread of bacteria and disease. However, the ritualized treatment of the bones gave them a way to protect the living from the spread of contagion. Washing bones with wine, for example, has been known to act as a disinfectant since Hippocrates' time, 2,500 years ago.
Through the ritualized treatment of the bones, the Greeks were literally protecting themselves from the dead. A process that could have lent favor to the tales of vampires.
In many areas in Greece, they used boiled wine and vinegar as a defense against the vampires or revenants, and this might have something to do with the disinfectant properties of these substances.
And there are other features of decomposition that can also substantiate the idea of the living dead. Sometimes a corpse might even move inside the grave.
One of the things that occurs to a body after death is a natural process, rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles after death. Some people believe it affects the body permanently, but that's not true. It's a temporary process. And as the body relaxes, it may cause it to appear to move within the coffin, and if there's movement there, it may also cause noises to come out of the coffin as well. And this could give the impression that the body's arising from the dead.
And even the look of the corpse could portray it as a vampire.
After death, the skin of the body dries out, dehydrates and shrinks a bit, and this can give the impression that stubble is growing on the face. Blisters form and the top surface of the skin can peel off and slip off. And the fingernails are growing, sometimes to a considerable length, and they can curve a little like a claw. And this can give the impression that the body is still alive, hair is still growing, fingernails are still growing. So it's perhaps no surprise that Hollywood has taken these three natural signs of decomposition, the facial hair growth, the long fingernails and the smooth skin, as being signs of the continuing life after death.
What you get when you see these vampire stories, especially with like the blood around the mouth, the rosy cheeks, these bodies apparently not decomposing as they should according to science, is you're pushing the boundaries of what science and what medicine, you know, the cutting edge of the day, can explain. I think that's one reason, I think that's the prime reason why people just go so mad for these vampire stories.
And were they then to drive a stake through the heart, that would tend to expel the gases that are developed in the body after death, make the body fart. It could certainly cause it to sigh. And this would, of course, reinforce their belief that this body had in fact been alive all the time.
So, ignorance of the body's decomposition cycle when it came to transferring the remains to the ossuary or mausoleum could offer evidence that vampires are real. Might this suggest a rationale for the stakes driven through the body of Vlad on the island of Lesbos?
Greece has a long tradition of vampire or revenant mythology. In the 17th to 19th century, European travelers would recount stories of how suspected vampires were exhumed and nailed inside in order to prevent them from rise again. And I think that's exactly what they found in the case of Vlad.
Here was a poor man who for what reason had been assumed to be a vampire. So when he died, he was treated as such, with stakes driven through his body.
They took a number of precautions to make sure that this man did not return from the dead. They put the stakes through him. They put the wooden sarcophagus around him. They built a special crypt for him. They put the heavy stones on top of the crypt to make sure that the coffin could not be opened. There was a reason, and we'll never know the reason, that they thought this man was a threat to the living, that he was a potential vampire.
Vlad's discovery shook the archaeological world and confirmed that vampires were. But why Vlad was considered to be a vampire remains little more than supposition.
It's likely they thought he was a vampire because of his behavior in his lifetime. There are a dozen reasons why one might have been thought to be a vampire. Strange behavior on your part, strange family history, particular evil reputation, mistake the priest might have made in the burial. There are all sorts of reasons. We don't know why they thought this particular man was a vampire.
We may never know for sure. But another, even more mysterious grave was soon to be found on Lesbos, one that could provide the answers. At the turn of the 21st century, beside the tiny church of Taxiarchus, high above Vlad, a second explain what it took.
In 1989, a team from the Greek Archaeological Service was restoring this medieval chapel. They were digging a drainage ditch around it, came across a series of burials running down the hill. One up here, perfectly normal. One here, somewhat deformed individual with two 16-centimeter stakes laid out on either side of him.
It was these stakes that provided the first clues that this burial was unique.
The stakes found inside the grave were too big to be coffin nails, and there is no sign that they were attached to anything. So I believe that they were placed there deliberately as a preventive measure to stop this man from transforming himself to a vampire.
Just like Vlad, who had been treated as a vampire when he died, with stakes driven through his body, here lay a man who it was expected would also rise from the grave. So why didn't the locals go through with the necessary action of staking him in place at the time of his funeral?
They weren't taking any chances, so they very carefully, after wrapping him in his winding sheet, buried him within 24 hours of death, in the usual Christian way, facing the east for the Last Judgment. As a precaution, they put these two spikes beside him. Why they didn't put them through him to keep him in there, we will never know, but they were there and they were intended to, we think, act as talismans to keep him in the grave.
Whilst the true nature of the Taxiarchus vampire remains unclear, a discovery on the other side of the world may reveal the purpose of these talisman stakes. In 1988, in the city of Mytilene on the Greek island of Lesbos, Hector Williams and his team of archaeologists unearthed the remains of a vampire they named Vlad, his body nailed into his grave. 10 years later, a second vampire was exhumed in a churchyard just a few miles out of town. These two finds have helped elevate the vampires of Eastern Europe from mythical beings to ones of historical fact. But why would someone be considered a vampire in the first place? Clues may lie on the other side of the world. In 1990, a series of shocking discoveries terrified a sleepy American town in New England. Archaeologists working on a gravel pit unearthed a necropolis dating back nearly 300 years to the time of the founding fathers. The cemetery contained the remains of an entire family, but one burial plot was distinct. Bearing the initials JB, when the coffin lid was opened, the archaeologists found that the bones had been rearranged into the sign of the skull and cross. Was this a pirate, or could there be a more startling explanation? Forensic scientist Anastasia Saliki has been re-examining the case for clues and to see if the find can be linked in any way to the vampires of Lesbos Island.
When the bones were first studied, it soon became clear that there was a series of lesions present. The appearance, the distribution, and the location of the lesions pointed out towards one disease, and that's tuberculosis, also known as TB. So the disease would have spread from the poor man's lungs onto his rib cage, and almost certainly it is what killed him.
Tuberculosis is a terrible disease that was rife in Eastern America in the 18th and 19th centuries, a period known to coincide with a spate of vampiric activity. So, could there be a connection between tuberculosis and vampires?
There are a number of symptoms of tuberculosis can be linked to vampirism. For instance, conjunctivitis, the red and inflamed eyes that often make people dislike going out in bright sunlight. Or there's the pallor of the skin associated with anemia of the disease, or the thin and thready pulse that's just associated with the debility of tuberculosis. Then, of course, there's the fact that people with tuberculosis are commonly coughing up blood. So yes, I can understand there's an argument for linking the symptoms of tuberculosis, which was also known as consumption, with the features of vampirism. Of course, these diseases are highly contagious, so they'll stick within a family group. And so when one member of the family has died, it's quite likely that other members of the family will die soon after.
Those who were infected would lose their health slowly. So it would appear as if life was drained away from them and that they were wasting away. I believe that this person died from tuberculosis, and his family caught the disease as well and soon followed him to the grave.
That JB's family members died so soon after him was a sure sign that he had become a vampire. And as the disease spread, hysteria may have gripped the community. There might have been an inclination to dig up the corpse and undertake the appropriate precautionary action. And there could have been other indicators of vampire activity, thanks to the volume of people dying at the time.
When many people are dying, this will lead to rapid burials, burials in shallow graves. And in the digging of those graves, other bodies will be disturbed, lead to scattering of the bones, maybe even body parts on the surface or protruding from the grave. And this appearance could give the impression that the bodies are becoming alive again and rising from the dead.
It may have been quite natural to take safety measures, to rebury the remains, to weigh them down with stones or a heavy casket, or to stake them into the grave to stop them rising again. Or perhaps in the case of JB, of simply rearranging his bones.
By rearranging the bones, they may have believed that they were immobilizing the corpse in the grave and that they were preventing it from coming out again.
And there is one further nail in the coffin to link tuberculosis to vampires. 50 miles away, in an abandoned cemetery in Rhode Island, lays a gravestone from 1841. It bears the inscription, "In memory of Simon Whipple, who died May the 6th, 1841. Although consumption's vampire grasp has seized that mortal frame."
Consumption is another name for tuberculosis, so maybe this is the proof of the link between tuberculosis and vampires, in New England at least.
And the link even made it into the popular literature of the time.
Francois-Marie Arouet, better known as Voltaire, was one of the greatest thinkers of the 18th century Enlightenment, and he wrote in his philosophical dictionary that vampires are corpses who went out of their graves at night to suck the blood of the living, either at their throats or stomachs, after which they returned to their cemeteries. The person so sucked waned, grew pale, and fell into consumption, while the sucking corpses grew fat, got rosy, and enjoyed an excellent appetite.
Proof. that in earlier times when people's understanding of disease and illness was limited, superstition held sway over fearful minds. Fine for the 18th century, but you'd be wrong if you thought that a belief in vampires had died out today. In February 2004, the authorities were called in to the small village of Craiova, southwest Romania, to investigate 6 people alleged to have impaled the body of a villager, Tom Petra, who, according to them, had transformed himself into a vampire after his death. My brother-in-law died, and when he died, he became a vampire. The villagers believed that Petra was returning from the grave and feasting on his next of kin.
I saw him coming at night. He was calling. I was screaming. He was sucking our blood.
His relatives were gradually fading away.
I had stomach ache. I turned yellow. Everybody in the neighborhood witnessed how bad I was feeling at night.
In Slavic society, it is still believed that a person's spirit lingers for 40 days after death. So there was only one solution. 6 weeks after his funeral, as midnight approached, Petra's family snuck into the cemetery and dug up his corpse. Its condition confirmed their worst suspicions. We found him with his hands at his side like this. His neck was torn, and his mouth was full of blood. A corpse full of blood, a sure sign that Petra had become a vampire.
Blood has a symbolism in many religions. There's the drinking of wine to symbolize Jesus' blood in Christianity, but there's also the drinking of blood to gain supernatural powers in many other religions. And so the presence of blood around the mouth must have been truly terrifying.
The villagers did what their beliefs required. We worked inside the grave, and we did everything properly. This is my pitchfork. We used it to remove the heart.
And a dead man's heart is not supposed to have blood in it if he isn't a vampire. So we burn it and we drank the ashes together with water. We drank the ashes and immediately we felt better.
In Romania, at least, the vampire is no legend. It remains a very real threat, a night-lurking creature that preys on our deepest fears in the margin between life and death. Vampires, entities that prey on your life force, creatures of the night that lurk in the borders between life and death. Modern medicine can explicate at least some vampire cases. But what of Vlad and the other vampires of Lesbos Island? It fell on Anastasia Seliki to examine the remains of the Taxiarchis vampire. She discovered that he was no Mr. Average, as Vlad had been.
The person found in the Taxiarchis grave had severe facial deformities, especially in the area of the nose and the jaws. And there was evidence of disease, like lesions on the skull, probably a fungal infection to the brain. What I think we have here is a poor, diseased and deformed man. We know from folklore that people with TB, rabies or deformities were thought to become vampires after death, and this is exactly what happened in this case.
The physical condition might have made people suspicious of him, added to outrageous behavior on his part, strange behavior on his part. The presence of the stakes does indicate a suspected revenant. So they weren't taking any chances. When he was buried, they put the stakes in and covered him up and So he remained till the fall of 1999 when we uncovered him.
But why didn't they drive their stakes home, as they had done with the earlier discovered Vlad?
Maybe they were squeamish, maybe they thought it was just enough to have them there as a sort of guardian of the grave.
Fearing he would rise again, the locals placed their vampire stakes beside him in the coffin. But Anastasia thinks these stakes may have had a practical purpose too.
The spikes inside the grave were sharp, and as the body swelled during decomposition, they would have pierced the flesh, and they would have released all the internal gases.
By releasing the gases built up during decay, the internal organs would have been exposed, and the corpse would have dried out.
That speeded up the rate of the decay. So after that, if somebody wanted to dig up the body, they would find only bones, no vampire. And to me, this shows that the locals were taking no chances.
There is one final twist to the story of Vampire Island. During his research over the last 30 years, Hector Williams has become fascinated by the writings of one of the area's most famous travel authors, Charles Thomas Newton.
In the 1860s, Charles Newton, who had been British vice consul at Mytilene, published his memoirs, Travels and Discoveries in the Levant. And he refers at one place to an island near Mytilene. In Mytilene, the bones of those who will not lie quiet in their graves are transported to a small adjacent island where they are reinterred. This is an effective bar against all future vagaries, for the vampire cannot cross salt water.
It's an intriguing clue, a written text from a respected author telling of a small island near Mytilene, containing not one vampire, but a whole vampire cemetery, thanks to the vampire's fear of salt water.
In Bram Stoker's classic Gothic novel, Dracula, the Count comes all the way from Transylvania by sea, travelling in a coffin which is filled with his native soil. And that is a tradition that Stoker had taken from Eastern European stories about vampires, or the fact the vampire couldn't travel over salt water.
It is believed in many places that vampires and other supernatural beings cannot cross salt water, so the villagers must have thought that to transfer and bury a corpse on an island would be more than enough to stop the vampire attacks.
If the historians and scientists are right, then somewhere off the coast of Lesbos lies the real vampire island, and the location of the world's first vampire cemetery.
Newton wrote these words about 140 years ago, and we've been wondering what the Greeks did with their vampires beside bury them locally. And finding this passage suggested that we found out where they went, over there, to this little island off the village of Pamphila.
From the shore, it's almost impossible to see any evidence of burials. So there's only one thing for it. Hector is going to take to the skies.
We've just taken off from Mytilene International Airport. We're heading due north to the island of Pamphila. We're about to come up on the island now, so things should start getting interesting. We're going to drop to about 500 feet, 150 meters. It may be a little bumpy, but we'll get a good view of the top of the island that way. We're going to circle around the island and look. You can see there's remains of a small building here on the north side.
There are foundations of what looks like a basement a little bit further east of it.
Could these be the burial sites? Places that may contain structures underground?
We have been able to pick out the lines of several buildings, foundations that indicate there are buried structures on the island. It's worth coming back with ground-penetrating radar and getting further details of the graves.
Who knows what he'll find? For now, Hector must wait, his curiosity whetted and replete in the knowledge that he may have discovered a world first. A graveyard for the undead. The real Vampire Island. Hector's research has confirmed beyond doubt that vampires once roamed the island of Lesbos.
People assume vampires are a myth, but the Central European Balkan vampire evolved in a particular way that has fascinated people since the 18th century.
Thanks to modern forensics, medicine and science, we now know that vampires were real people. Outcasts from society, stricken with disease, deformities, or mental illness.
He must have been an outcast, and this is why he was treated as a vampire after he died.
And even today, in some parts of the world, vampires are still regarded as a very real threat. One of the most alluring and enduring of all supernatural beings.
Lucifer, Satan, Beelzebub, Old Nick. The devil has many names and many different faces. Sometimes he appears as a monster, sometimes he's human. As the arch-fiend ruling over hell, he's terrifying.
But it wasn't always this way.
If you go looking for the devil that we would recognise in this period, you don't find anthropomorphising images of the devil, sort of humanoid but with wings and a tail and cloven hooves. You don't find that.
That's because the devil we know today is a human creation.
This was probably the image they took to create the image of Lucifer or the devil.
Owing more to the minds of artists than to the pages of the Bible. Invented and reinvented by generations for whom he became a tantalizing, perverse muse.
It's a tumultuous, sadomasochistic fantasy. This is as much porno as it is inferno.
The devil is a mysterious, seductive, and ambiguous character. But for nearly 1,000 years, there was no consensus on what he looked like. From the end of the Roman Empire to the cusp of the Renaissance in Italy,